The United States, the mightiest army, was on Iran's borders from two sides, from Afghanistan and Iraq.
Iran obviously has had a mixed relationship with the Arab world, since for a long period, going back thousands of years. But specifically, if you look at the time of the Islamic Republic since 1979,
even a war for Iran is better than caving in to what Trump and Netanyahu want. There is nothing left for less hardline people in the political system in Israel. And this is the biggest foe to Israel because it keeps it in a circle of violence.
Even if Israel didn't exist, the US would probably try to deter this because that would be a very strong bloc, whether it's just an economic bloc, whatever kind of bloc that is, that would be a threat to any hegemonic power, right?
I think what transpired the past 2 months is to affect the future of the region as in unprecedented shapes and forms. There's this sense of Israeli push for supremacy in the region that is bringing countries together against it.
Hassan, we should be starting in like about a minute or two. Sorry? Okay, great.
Ready to roll.
2, 1. Hi, good day. Welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaq Kareem, and I'm really honored to welcome to not to our studio, but over Zoom today, Hassan Ahmadian. Hassan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Hassan is a political scientist at the University of Tehran, and if you've been following the events of the war on Iran by the US and Israel, you've probably seen him on Twitter, you've probably seen clips of him on Al Jazeera. He's a thoughtful and very outspoken defender of Iranian policy and has been given a lot of perspective to both the Arab world and I guess to speakers in the English world on Iran and it's how it perceives this war. Hassan, I hope to spend the next hour with you discussing many things. Really, I think what the crux of this conversation is going to be, it's going to be trying to understand how Iran sees the region and how Iran thinks about this war, both in terms of a long-term strategy and a short-term strategy. We're obviously going to speak about the current sort of standoff that's been happening in the Straits of Hormuz. But before we get there, just before February 28th, before Israel launched an attack that killed Ali Khamenei and many other leaders, and then dragged the U.S. into this war by many accounts, that's the narrative. On the 28th of February, since then, how has the region changed? From an Iranian perspective, from an Israeli perspective, from the Gulf states perspective, from Saudi Arabia. I'm not counting as it's a Gulf state, obviously, but it's not a small Gulf state. And obviously from the U.S. interest in the region. It's a big question, but it really is the essence of what we're going to be speaking about today. So how has the region changed from today, compared to 28th of February?
Well, I think there are lots of things to delve into in answer to that question, but let me shorten it as much as I can. I think what transpired the past 2 months is to affect the future of the region as in unprecedented shapes and forms. And I think that has a lot to do with what the United States used to do and what it is doing now and what will its role be in the future. Now, the United States, from the revolution, the Iranian Revolution of 79, depicted Iran as the other because it freed itself of U.S. influence. The Shah was allied with the United States. And then, of course, the Islamic Republic took a non-alignment posture, saying, no, neither East nor West, we are independent. That changed a lot of the politics that was ongoing between Iran and the United States. The relationship turned from an alliance to animosity. The United States tried to topple the Islamic Republic right after the revolution, the Nojeh coup, but wasn't successful. And of course, its pressure piled on, moving to today's wars on Iran. Now, the United States waged 2 wars around Iran, in Afghanistan and Iraq in the process, and of course had a strong sanctions and pressure campaigns on Iran. The first was crippling sanctions during the Obama administration, and the second was the maximum pressure during the Trump first term in office. In both cases, the main logic that this administration, the second Trump administration, got out of it was that Iran reverts back and succumbs to pressure, which is basically not the case if we take into account what happened between Iran and the United States the past year, the Iranians went into a deal back in 2015, thinking that this will open the space for more, interest-based relationship with the United States, both U.S. interests and Iran interests. They dumped it a win-win agreement, only to be shocked 3 years later that the United States violated it and imposed the maximum pressure campaign. The logic of that campaign was that Iran succumbs to pressure. So the way forward is not negotiations. It's to pile up the pressure through the maximum pressure and then force it to agree to what the United States wants. This didn't lead to but escalation. Then we saw the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. And then, of course, the 7th of October and the two wars that were waged on Iran after the back and forth between Iran and Israel. The United States moved gradually from strong presence in regional politics into subcontracting its policy to Israel. In the past few years, the Israelis have been directing U.S. policies towards Iran. Now, I often say in this war, for instance, there's nothing for the United States in it. The United States doesn't have any interest that I can see in basically getting involved in such a war with Iran. But because it subcontracted its policy to Israel and the Israelis managed to drag it into the war, they got involved, thinking that of course, a Venezuela model can unfold in Iran if that is to happen. And they did. President Trump talked about 3 days of operation that was supposed to bring down the Islamic Republic. That didn't happen. Of course, if you have a nuanced understanding of Iran's political system, you wouldn't have thought so. I think the Israelis didn't think the way they told President Trump through the Mossad, the report that was circulated as the main plan that was presented to President Trump for him to be incentivized to move against Iran militarily. All of the points in it were basically a plan to drag the United States, nothing more, not a serious plan of bringing down Iran or its political system. Of course, those are hopes, but policies are not based on hopes. The policies are based on planning. And so the United States got involved in a war that it's not its war. It's not basically appealing war within the United States. And it's not legal because the Congress didn't back it. It's not legal internationally because the UN Security Council didn't authorize it. And so it's illegal in many ways. And ergo, the rules-based system upon which the United States used to talk to other nations, though it did what it did before without really that much attention to international law, but at least the outer layer was that the United States is keeping up the international law and the rules-based system. Now it's moving beyond that. It's no longer observing the rules-based system. And ergo, the Iranian way of retaliation. The Iranians learned it the hard way that international law is not supposed to support them and stop wars waged on them. We can call them illegal, but it doesn't change the reality that they are facing. And so they went hard against the United States and its bases, assets, and of course the Israelis who attacked the country. 2 wars were waged on Iran simultaneously, one from an air campaign from Israel, another from southern Iran, which was a land, sea, and of course air campaign. And we saw lots of footage from the CENTCOM, etc., that points to the belief that lands were used, bases were used, and of course the aircraft carriers were used, and the Air Force was used. And so the bulk of Iran's war effort focused on the CENTCOM infrastructure, and that, of course, created a rift between Iran and some Arab countries that host those bases and assets. And that's where I think we should think of the future of relationships between Iran and Arab countries. That's one effect that I think is unprecedented. Iran never attacked those countries the way it did because of the US war and the CENTCOM war on the country. Of course, some of them, I mean, one particularly the UAE severed its ties with Iran. And of course, that is to be reckoned with moving forward between Iran and the UAE, the Iranian strategy. But the way the war transpired connected Iran's security to the regional security, and also Iran's economy and security to the global economy and oil markets and energy markets. And that was an Iranian plan. You know, the war plan of Iran was based on two things: the experience of the 12 days war on one side, and the preparations that they were seeing the United States and Israelis are doing around them, specifically in the CENTCOM infrastructure in the GCC countries. And so they retaliated accordingly and planned their war plan against the United States and Israel accordingly. And that led to changes in the mindsets in the, I think, the GCC in Iran, and also moving forward, I think, regionally. I think one big strategic question in the region will be how can we achieve collective security? That's the main strategic question. The Iranians found their answers long ago, but they didn't have a case to point to. Now they have a case. They tell their neighbors that these bases were used against us. They were pointed at us. But before the war, we couldn't say so. We said so, but I mean, many countries would say, no, this is for our security. Now they have a strong case to make. And I think the biggest question, the same question, and with a bigger weight, I would say, a heavier burden will be on the GCC countries. How can we have security after this war? Are these bases to secure us or to insecure us? And I think the answer is very much different from what we had before the war.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I know you said it will be a short answer, but it's a very long one, but I think it's very comprehensive, and there's a lot that we're going to pick up from that answer to really discuss the rest of the episode. I think the natural step to start would be, you mentioned that to a large extent the US doesn't seem to have an interest in this war. And they've outsourced their security to Israel. Now, currently, there's been a standoff over negotiations in the Strait of Hormuz, not even, a standoff in the Strait of Hormuz, which is obviously happening. But you've seen this pattern really from the time Iran sort of blocked the straits, where Trump, threatened some sort of bombing or something worse. And then he says, we're about to make a peace deal. And then the Iranians refuse to talk. Now, to a large extent, that's likely, because, Israel dragged the U.S. into this. Like you said, there was probably an expectation that the war would end sooner than it has with a US/Israeli victory. That has not happened. Iran obviously have not been too keen to talk, probably because exactly what you said. They have seen the history. They have seen that every time they do sign negotiations, they do sort of make plans, they do make commitments, they're stabbed in the back, or effectively, sanctions are lifted again or are not lifted. And there have been random bombings of the country, or attacks even preceding, various members of the Iranian state from before October 7th. So what is Iran now hoping to secure in this negotiation? What do you think will actually have to occur for there to be a deal? The U.S. seems reluctant to actually go into a full-scale war, so they are blocking Iran's blockade, if that makes sense. But they're reluctant to go into a full-scale war because I think they do want a solution. At the same time, Israel is bombing Lebanon. And, they've continued that, which is in violation by many people's readings of the ceasefire. Israel says it isn't. Some, members of the U.S. state have also said it's not. But by many people's readings, that is in violation of the ceasefire that currently stands. So what would Iran need, for it to actually achieve, for there to be a resolution and an agreement?
There are many points that you raised. I think the Iranians were never reluctant to talk with the United States. Directly or indirectly, where it depends on the circumstance. The war that was waged on the country led to 40 days, 39 days of bloodshed, attacks on infrastructure, and a military standoff that went to unprecedented levels. And the result was that the United States did not achieve anything of its goals, at least announced goals. That's very clear to Iran. But the Iranians, despite that fact, went to negotiations because they thought the ceasefire can be the basis upon which Iran and the United States can reach an agreement that would end the animosity. And of course, one other point is that the Iranians never left the table. You see, back in 2015, they reached a deal. The United States reneged on it. They continued discussing. They didn't withdraw from the JCPOA despite the U.S. violation of it and violation of the UN Security Council 2231. The Iranians stayed in it and continued discussions, hoping that this will lead to a negotiated settlement against the warmongers in Washington and Israel, but that didn't materialize. Still, they engaged the new U.S. administration back in June when another war was waged, or a war was waged on the country. In February, where another war was waged on the country. In Pakistan, just lately, where a third war was waged on the country, because a siege, per international law, is an act of war. That's a third war that is imposed on the country. And so when you have this track record, you would deal with the United States with maximum caution. You can't just go for negotiations without shielding yourself against that foe. Now, there was a deal just lately, a ceasefire agreement, and that was supposed to be the basis for an agreement, a long-term agreement. But what happened afterward? The ceasefire was violated, as you said, in Lebanon. And then it was violated against with a siege imposed on the country. And thirdly, it was violated by the United States trying to change the grounds for a deal by trying to open the Strait of Hormuz by force. All three are very clear violations of the same deal that Iran had with the United States just lately. How can you deal with such a foe when it doesn't observe any agreement? It doesn't go for negotiations with sincere willingness to engage honestly and honorably and observe its words. It didn't do that back in the days of the first Trump administration, and it didn't do it just lately with the ceasefire agreement. And so the Iranians did not really leave the negotiating table. It just thought that, well, if we are to negotiate and after a negotiation, another war is to be imposed on the country, we're better off without negotiations. We can send our messages to the mediators and the Americans can send their messages to the mediators. There's no need for negotiations at this point. We can have a back and forth with messages through the mediators. And that's what has been going on. Now, when it comes to the content, the United States came to the table in Pakistan as if it was the winning party trying to impose its terms of surrender on Iran. The Iranians didn't see the situation the way the United States saw it. They fought a lengthy war and stopped the United States short of achieving any of its objectives. And in addition, they accumulated strategic points. On top of them is the Strait of Hormuz. And so they were eyeing a settlement that would be based on a give and take. That's diplomacy. But it was obvious to them that the United States is not in that mood. They were asking Iran to give up its oil to be managed by the United States, an Iraq-style oil management, that the money would go to the treasury and the Iranians would ask for their project to be financed by the treasury, by their own money. That's unacceptable for any sovereign nation. The second was that Iran should give up its nuclear material to the United States, its foe that just attacked the country. That was unacceptable to the Iranians. And also and Iran has to open the Strait of Hormuz like before the war, as if nothing happened. There was no war, without even a payback by the United States. They were talking about, inshallah, in the future, we will do sanction relief, we will do reparations by other means. But that wasn't, to be accepted by Iran for obvious reasons. There is no trust in the United States, and the United States never observed its commitments towards Iran. So to say that Iran is not really keen to get to a settlement is, I think, a a stretch from reality, from what transpired in those negotiations. Still, the Iranians are sending their messages, they're sending their reviewed proposals to the mediators to be sent to the United States. But I don't see really that the rift is so huge that I don't see them, the two sides coming closer by mediator efforts anytime soon. Because, as I said, President Trump wants everything. The Iranians are not willing to give him everything. They want a fair trade-off that can be called a win-win situation. Obviously, the Trump administration wants a win-lose situation. When it comes to, I can talk about the Strait of Hormuz as well, but I'll leave it up to you.
Okay, no, I mean, we'll get to the Strait of Hormuz just in a second. Just to follow up on what you said, I do agree with you. I can see how the Iranians would not want to deal with this foe, which is consistently not kept its word. At the same token, I can't see Donald Trump backing down from his dystopian way of the world and thinking, and the fact that he wants, as you mentioned, a win-lose situation. So what's the third path, right? Because Iran, as you mentioned, now its ports are under siege. That's obviously hurting the economy. The Gulf states are hurting as these straits are closed. The global economy is soon going to it's already seeing the impact, but soon the impact of the straits remaining closed for a longer period will also be quite detrimental. At the same token, Israel, that I think we both agree is a big problem in the region. It's instigated so many wars, so much instability in the region. I can only see that it's benefiting from the standoff, from the sense that, it's competitor states, even though it may be friendly to some of them, or they may be allied even with the UAE, but its competitor states are now suffering. And, Iran is obviously, while its stature maybe as a power that can resist the U.S. imperialism has increased, obviously the economy and the people are being damaged by this blockade. So what's the third option in terms of balancing this from an Iranian perspective to achieve the following, better Iran's interests, but also, as you mentioned, repair the rift that has occurred between Iran and the Gulf states that, now have been attacked because of what's happened in the war?
I think there are three ways to deal with it in general terms. A win-win solution that would give Iran and take from Iran, and of course, give and take, basically, diplomacy in essence, which it seems that the United States is not into. A second scenario is a lose-lose situation, a continued rift and standoff, and probably wars moving forward. That can very much be in the horizon. And a third one, which is basically a win-lose situation, which the Iranians are not willing to give. Now, what changed the equation between Iran and the United States as a result of the war is that it's not only Iran that is the party to be suffocated by the United States, because they are imposing a siege with the aim of suffocating 90 million Iranians. It's the global economy and the global oil and gas markets that is being suffocated, which will affect the global markets in general, including in the United States. We saw the questions raised against or on U.S. president and his officials in his administrations about the oil prices. That was expected. And so this situation is also a lose-lose situation. It can exacerbate in the form of military action, which will also be a lose-lose situation, because both parties have the capabilities to inflict pain on one another, and more broadly inflict pain on the global economy, as happened in the war and after the war. The Iranians have a card. That's the main change. The Iranians have the Strait of Hormuz, and they don't need much to control it. They just have to announce and observe. And no one would dare cross it without coordinating with the Iranians, because the previous occasions showed that they might be attacked. And so the United States needs a lot of equipment and forces to do anything against this situation in the Strait of Hormuz, whereas for the Iranians, it's an easy job. It's not that big of a hurdle for them to keep it the way it is. And so in terms of the way the standoff is managed, it's totally to Iran's favor. In addition, the Iranians have their own ways of circumventing sanctions that they basically mastered during the past decade on how to go around sanctions, how to deal with the sanctions that the United States was imposing on the country and the Europeans later on imposed on the country. And they really are the masters of this. And I don't see them, that much under the pressure that other countries that are not used to sanctions are under. They are coping with this, and they cannot, just because they don't have basically the geographic location that Iran has with 15 neighbors. They don't have the experience that Iran has with sanctions and circumventing sanctions, and they don't have the political will to stand up to the pressures that is coming from outside that Iran has against Israel and the United States. And so the way forward is a settlement. If we are to calm the markets, we are to end the siege, and we are to end the standoff, the military and security standoff. But I don't see any inclination in Washington or in Israel to that end. If anything, we see accumulation of forces and equipments, military equipments. We see efforts for security infiltration into the country, sending arms to some groups, armed groups like the MEK, the royalists, separatist groups trying to instigate an armed uprising, a civil war. They want to see, and they were clear in it during the war. I mean, many talking points came out, and we saw what they did in Iran. Many reports came on this, that they were trying to get the arms into Iran for a civil war to erupt, and another Syria to basically unfold in Iran, or another Gaza if a Syrian model would not be achievable. That is a continuation of bombardment, killing, and infrastructures being demolished by the Israelis and the Americans. But there was a variable that stopped them short of going for either scenario, that is Iran's might and willingness to inflict pain, not only on Israel, but also on the United States, rendering 14 out of 16 bases out of service around it. And that was unprecedented. That was what stopped the war. And I think moving forward, I see them trying to remedy their challenges during the war and waging another one on Iran, thinking that this can change the equation. With Iran, of course, readying itself and remedying its own challenges during the war, trying to cope with the new situation for the next round. So both parties are readying themselves for the next round. Now, the hope is before we get to that next round, which only Israel, I think, has an interest in, a settlement can be reached. I think Arab countries, Pakistan, Turkey, other countries around the region, and also global powers like China want to see a settlement short of a war. But that needs to be based on a give and take, a win-win solution, which I don't see the United States, ready for. Now, with regards to the GCC, I think with an exception or two, all are pushing the United States for a settlement, a diplomatic settlement, and trying to do what they can to see that. But at the same time, their efforts of stopping this war did not pay off. They actually were outbalanced by a single person named Bibi Netanyahu in pushing the United States to wage a war on Iran. So you can't really bank that much on this pressure in trying to stop the war or the next round of war on the country. The main thing that would push the United States into a win-win solution is the pressure that is being piled on the economics of the United States. It's not quite there yet, but I think moving forward it's either a war or a solution that can stop the pressure, which is elevating by the day.
Okay, so you've walked us through, what a potential, and I do think we're in a state of like a long war, irrespective. But you kind of walked us through, what would happen if long war was inevitable, not was there would be attempts by the U.S. and Israel to create chaos within Iran, and there'd also be bombardments. Now, you also mentioned that a big lever to that is the international community, the Gulf states and China and other powers. Now, the USA reached out to a bunch of its allies to ask for help in blocking the blockade of the Straits of Hormuz. Basically, everyone said no. There's been lots of talk that the Chinese have been keen and have been in a way behind the talks that are happening in Pakistan because they want to see an end to this. It's clear that the European economy, while not taking as much of a hit as the Gulf economies and Iran would take, will also be taking a hit because of the choking of the Straits of Hormuz. Do you think, because I do agree with you that, it seems like the US is following Netanyahu, and I don't just think it's Netanyahu, I think it's the deeper Israeli state and the fact that they have always wanted to see instability in the region. Specifically, for a long while now, they want to, create instability in Iran to weaken it, but also so that instability can spread out and weaken the region. Do you think, and I know that it seems a bit illogical because this was always the status of the world before Donald Trump was really the president, but if a bunch of international powers, even in a world where, might was right, and even in a world where people were exercising imperialism and using international war for imperialistic reasons, even then, international powers kind of had some consensus and were able to restrain powers from behaving in a way which was going to be really disruptive to many of them. But do you see them now, especially because Trump's isolated them? Trump has isolated Europe. He always speaks down towards them. If anything, China seems to be, the linchpin where Trump still has a respect for them, mainly because they're strong. Do you see the international community, a mixture of, these diplomatic pockets, the Gulf, Europe, China? Do you see them being able to really rein Trump in? It's clear that he's speaking and he's preparing his statements or his tweets either over what he wants to say or to quell the markets. But do you see a solution? Do you see them actually being able to restrain him and bring him to say, okay, I'm gonna try to restrain myself and go away, which is finding, if not peace, but a solution of sorts?
Well, I think when it comes to Trump isolating his allies and many other countries, I don't see it that way. I think Trump isolated the United States. You see that in Europe with countries in Europe saying that, no, it's not our war. That was an illegal war. You did it. We are not getting involved in it. And we see the criticism from all around the world against what the United States did. And so, in effect, it has the might to keep going on, but that is not the only source that the United States used to use in international relations that it conducted against its foes. Coalition building was the essence with which the United States and the basis upon which the United States went to invade Afghanistan and then Iraq, though it was an illegal war back then in Iraq as well, but still it has a coalition. The Europeans, many of them were fighting alongside the Americans. In this war, no one is on board with the United States but the most hated country in the world, that is Israel. And so no other country is willing to get involved with the United States and Israel against Iran, not only because of the will, because of the illegality, but because of the potentiality of making a change as well. You see, even if the will was there, which I don't see it, even if the legality was there, which I don't see it, the United States showed the world the limits of military power when it comes to Iran, not a peer competitor, a middle power. It kept its naval forces like more than 1,000 kilometers away from Iran's territorial water, not to be hit by Iran. It emptied its bases around Iran that were constantly hit. There was a systematic campaign by Iran on not to let the United States make use of any asset in those bases. And that was very successful, according to reporting by New York Times, CNN, and other outlets. And so the capability is something that the United States need to reckon with. What can other countries add to U.S. war efforts against Iran in naval terms? I don't see that much. What other countries are willing to do that? I don't see many. And of course, what is the legal basis? It's not there. And so pressure from other parts of the world, as you said, diplomatic pockets against the U.S. Approach to Iran and the region in coordination with Israel and doing basically Israel bidding, that can over time accumulate a pressure within the United States. But from where I see it, Trump does not really answer to that or react to that pressure. Pressure within is the main thing against him to be used, I think. And the main thing that the Iranians are doing is basically connecting the situation, the siege on the Hormuz and their ports, to the economics within the United States. I think Iran has more sway than U.S. allies in pressurizing Trump because of this, because of the oil markets and energy markets and the prices of gasoline and other oil products within the United States. And we see that, being talked about in the United States. Moving forward, imagine in 1 or 2 months, I don't see the Iranians really changing their policy because of a siege imposed on them. And the siege is not being observed completely. The Iranians are still trading. But in any case, even if the siege is completely imposed and basically enacted against Iran, and the Iranians do not retaliate against it, which is highly unlikely. If the siege is to be implemented, I think the Iranians will take it as a war and react to it as such. But in any case, if it doesn't even react in 1-2 months with the strait closed, I think the prices of energy would skyrocket. It wouldn't affect Iran that much because Iran is basically, it has its own oil and it's working within based on what it has. It would affect the United States and oil and gas markets globally. And I think it will create a crisis, an energy crisis. It is already being talked about by professionals. And I think it's coming to the global economy. That's the main source of pressure. And I don't see how the United States can tap that off. It's basically there in Iran's hands. And the only way for the United States to remedy this is through a negotiated settlement with Iran. Now, Trump's persona weighs in here. He doesn't want to appear weak and given in to Iran in a give and take deal. He wants to announce that he won. The Iranians, of course, have their own policy. They don't want to encourage the United States that anytime you want something, you can attack the country or impose more sanctions on the country and get what you want. That strategically doesn't make sense, and it's based on the previous encounters and negotiations and wars with the United States. They don't want to see that unfold again, and so they are not willing to give Trump what he wants. His persona needs to be spoon-fed with a win in Iran, and that's not going to happen. And ergo, the other option is a conflict. And I think a conflict would not achieve anything again, because the Iranians, as well as the Americans, are readying themselves for that. And the Iranians have two wars and 2 experiences of conflict, not only with Israel, but also with the United States. It's the country with the most experience now in fighting off 2 strong foes at the same time and not caving in any shape or form, but also accumulating strategic points. So it doesn't see that the worst scenario. It sees giving into what Trump is asking and trying to impose on the country as the worst case scenario. And they are not going to do that before, they are not basically willing to do that because they see the other option is a conflict, which is less costly to Iran because it will preserve its independence and its wealth on its land. We are not in a really ideal situation because of U.S. position and because of Israeli provocations for a war to erupt. But even a war for Iran is better than caving in to what Trump and Netanyahu want.
Okay. It'll be interesting. And obviously, you know about this because you have ties with people within Iran. You are from Iran, so you know the state. But what's that discussion like inside of state? Especially because there's basically a whole there's not an entirely new generation of leadership, but a lot of the old leadership has been killed. And so and Mujtaba Khamenei is basically he's ill, he's injured, he's in hiding because obviously he's trying to ensure he doesn't also get assassinated. How is the state, its various elements, how is it sort of keeping this discussion alive? How is it having a discussion with itself in terms of the policy to pursue? When this war just started, I think most people who are watching the news or following this, we saw Arakchi and we saw Pezeshkian being quite prominent. Now we see Ghalibaf as the main prominent person. What's the discussion happening inside the state? Both between the IRCG and the people who are part of the state but aren't part of the IRCG or have ties with the IRCG but may not see eye to eye with those who have empowered Mujtaba Khamenei but still are stakeholders because they're important elected officials in the state. What's that discussion like, and how is it seeing this war?
Well, to sum it up, I think the discussion, it's a very much vibrant and debating society strategically and also on a public level. Strategic debates in Iran are ongoing. Always, you could hear about them. You could see the logics and arguments being put on the table by various factions, various figures, and of course, you could hear them also in outlets, newspapers, etc. It's a very debating society generally. Now, those debates are ongoing. Many people are talking about the possibility of war, the things that I just mentioned, how to deal with it, what kind of a deal is acceptable to Iran, whether or not a deal short of a war in any shape or form is acceptable, or should Iran fight another war without caving in to Trump or basically and Netanyahu is a better option. These are different debates with nuances, really. I can't really delve into much of them, but to basically sum it up within the system, you see, there's a very clear constitutional frame for those debates to occur and basically be brought into the system. That is the Supreme National Security Council, in which all stakeholders in the system are members of, 13 members. That includes the heads of the IRGC, the Artesh, the Iranian military, many key ministers, the president, representatives of the supreme leader, and also head of the parliament, head of the judiciary, key figures that are the main people in the decision-making process. They bring in the debates that are ongoing within the strategic circles in Iran into that body, and the decision is usually taken through a vote after discussions. Some of them last for hours, some of them last for days, and some cases we hear that they last for weeks and months before a decision and a vote is taken. And so they basically debate all of these arguments and then get to a conclusion. And it's not really like what the United States is portraying as the IRGC having the upper hand. It's one member along with other members. Now, the Supreme Leader has the potentiality of changing the vote, and constitutionally, he has a veto power over its decisions. The previous Supreme Leader did not really interfere and usually observed the consensual mechanism with which the decision was being made, the strategic decision was being made. And I see the new Supreme Leader doing the same, at least from what we hear up until now. That is, the consensus within the system should be leading the country. And that's the way the decisions are made. Now, to what extent the IRGC or the regular army have a more sway on decision making, I don't buy that logic really. During wartime, though, usually it's the time of more stronger, I would say, arguments by military side of the system, and that's not a unique case or unique position you see in Iran. It's something global. When there's a war, you have military arguments on the table more than others. And that might be the case in this time as well. But it doesn't mean that the IRGC is taking the decisions or directing the country towards something that others disagree with. I think it's more nuanced of a discussion. Then the decision is taken, and then the decision, when once taken, is presented to the Supreme Leader, and the Supreme Leader ratifies it or amends it, and he has, as I said, he has the right to basically object to it, and then it will be discussed again with new nuances. And so it's a very vibrant mechanism with which the decision is taken, and usually when it's taken and ratified by the Supreme Leader, it's a decision. No one can really challenge it. And so this collective sort of consensual-based decision-making has kept Iran above water, despite all the pressure, economic, military, security, etc., pressures that were piled on the country, kept the country above water and kept it moving on. And I think it's still the case. The system, after the assassination of the previous Supreme Leader and many commanders, many officials, many, including the United States, believed that the system will collapse. I didn't see the system moving 1 inch out of the constitutional frame that was there. The Supreme Leader was basically a temporary leadership council was formed according to the Constitution. The Assembly of Experts gathered, elected a new Supreme Leader according to the Constitution. And then, of course, all the commanders that were assassinated were appointed according to the Constitution as well. So it's a very constitutional way of dealing with decisions and basically observing the outcomes of them. And so based on them, the country is where it is. And I think moving forward, the system will work as it used to work in the past.
Okay, so I mean, obviously, Iran's sovereignty has been under attack since basically the revolution, and obviously in the time of war, it's very much under attack. And the Iranian government has always been, quite good at ensuring that it wants to maintain that sovereignty, even at the expense of sanctions and war and other pressures that have been applied. A few weeks ago, I spoke to someone who's actually exiled from Iran, Mohsin Kadiveh, who's a mujtahid. He studied in Qom. He had a relationship with Khomeini at one point. He was taught by many of Khomeini's peers. He himself said, he really commends how the current government is dealing with the issue of sovereignty, and hats off to them because they've maintained their sovereignty. But often a very big criticism from him, but also from other people, is that, within Iran, there has been an issue of, autocracy leading into leadership. And we saw, just before this war, there were protests against the government. Yes, a lot of them were instigated by Mossad, and there's evidence of that. But, so going back, decades now, there's been reform movements in Iran that don't necessarily want to, embrace the US. There have been that element as well, but they want to see more freedoms. I know it's not the time to be focusing on that discussion because Iran's been attacked in an illegal war, as you mentioned. But just what are your thoughts on how that plays in to the discussion that's happening on how Iran maintains its sovereignty, and the fact that, as you're mentioning, you may be going into, unfortunately, being dragged into now a very long, prolonged war potentially?
That's has always been part of the debates within the system, as well as within different factions. And as vibrant as the political spaces in Iran, we saw different faces. Now, if you revert back to the first decade after the revolution, the political system, the political space in Iran is from another world. It's totally different. It adapted by the day. I have much criticism about many policies. Many of my colleagues, many people that I know have many criticisms against how policy is conducted, corruption, mismanagement, etc. But generally, the country has been on a movement of shifting and coping and adapting. And I think you could see it even in social life. You could see it in the political debates in the country. There are lots of criticisms still on the system, but I think it has been really very well adapting with the situation. Though my biggest criticism is that it is always lagging. it's always slow to adapt new policies. It can be way faster. It can observe and basically, try to cope with those differences and new trends in the society, in the political space, without being challenged by them. But they usually, because of its slowness, it usually faces the challenge and then try to cope with it, which is, I think, one of the biggest shortcomings in the system, and that's because of the nature of the system. I think if you look at traditional diversion between or difference between two basic political systems based on democracy. There's the Republican one. There's a parliamentary one. The parliamentary one is usually very slow compared to the presidential one. And so when it takes a decision, it takes it in a lengthy period, but then it sticks with it. I can, look at the Iranian decision-making process, including what I just explained in the Supreme National Security Council and the different institutions within the system, and basically liken it or basically compare it to a parliamentary democracy. The decision making is so slow, but once a decision is made based on a consensus, it is the decision that the system takes and then moves on and acts accordingly. And so it's not only about the essence of the matters that are shifting within the society and within the political space and within Iran's economics, but also because of the nature of the system being slow in adapting and moving according to the changes that are engulfing the country and its nation. The decisions are usually slow, and so I see what the points raised by Professor Kadivar come from. I agree with many of them, but at the same time, I can see the logic behind it, and I can see also the changes that happened in the society and the way the system tried to adapt to those changes. In the past 2 years, for instance, when it comes to civil liberty and the way there was morality police in the country, around the country. Over time, the system realized that this is not accepted to many Iranians. It was slow to understand that, but now there is no morality police as used to be in the system. It could have, preceded, this decision could have preceded the Mahsa Amini protest, the Women Life Freedom protest in the country, and deprive it of the necessity of the ugly, clashes we saw on the streets, but it was slow to adapt. That's my biggest, basically, criticism of the system that I hope can be remedied moving forward.
Do you fear that because of the war environment that there could actually be a backsliding, that the reflex to respond actually gets slower?
Well, I think wars have a lot of effects on political systems, but I think since if you divide the Iranian society into three portions, there is the strong base of the system, there is the gray zone, which is the biggest, and there are those who oppose the system. During war, the gray zone moves closer to the strong base of the system, and so you don't need really to strengthen your presence in the society to observe the developments and basically move against new trends in the society. The society is back in the system more than any time during wartime. And so I don't see that happening. But generally, of course, because of what the United States and Israel are now doing, they are doing two things basically after the ceasefire. They're trying to send in arms. Every day there are reportings of, uncovering of arms and arresting some people, trying to move in arms, move in people that are willing to fight, and from separatist movements, from opposition, armed opposition into the country. And the second thing that they have been doing is to basically gather info about and intel about sensitive places, figures, etc., for the next round of attacks, to have a target list. These two things that are being done by the Israelis and the Americans, is creating more sensitivity within the system. But also the system is channeling that to the society, asking them to observe any sensitive issue and report back. Many would not do that. Some would do that. But in general, that limits the level with which the system can basically open up the space. But I don't see it really closing it. So we are moving as before the war.
Okay, we've discussed a lot of geopolitics. The other big part of war is narrative. Now, obviously, the two are also related, naturally speaking. But in terms of narrative, in terms of this war, there's the very famous, Lego movies that have come about, the Iranian embassy tweets, which, have caused a lot of, I think it's allowed people who look at Iran from the outside, specifically in the English-speaking world, or, to kind of see that Iran is edgy, it's different. It's not as is painted, this country of repressive rights and just ayatollahs and mullahs who are running the place, but it's snappy, it's involved in popular culture, it understands the war of narrative, it understands the big arguments that are going on inside the USA. Specifically, you yourself have been, you've been, I think the reason why we're reaching out to you is because we've clipped up a bunch of your sound bites on Al Jazeera Arabic specifically, where you speak to an Arab audience. Iran obviously has had a mixed relationship with the Arab world, since for a long period, going back thousands of years. But specifically, if you look at the time of the Islamic Republic since 1979, there was a war with Iraq. There was a lot of violence in Iraq, after the U.S. invasion, from many sides, from Iraqi militias, from militias that were loyal to elements of Iran, from the U.S. forces themselves. A lot of violence there. There was a lot of violence in Syria due to Iran's footprints in Syria and its support of the Assad regime. How do you think this war has, and now you're seeing Gulf states being attacked by Iran. So I know it's a complex relationship that Iran has always had with the region. But how do you think the narrative war specifically has impacted how the Arab street thinks about Iran?
Well, I think the Arab street views Iran's logic with more acceptance, as I personally observe different places. And of course, it depends on the country. We can't talk about the Arab world in general. Each country has its own way of looking at Iran and the society, of course. Now, of course, the countries that saw Iran attacking bases in their soil have a different view than others who see a bigger picture of Israel and the United States attacking Iran, and Iran retaliating against those attacks. That's obvious. Now, when it comes to Iran-Arab relations, it started really in a very rocky space. That is, the Iranians had their revolution, and then a war was imposed on the country. Most Arab countries supported Iraq against Iran. That really dealt a serious blow to Iran-Arab relations. Moving forward, after the war ended, the Iranians tried to reconstruct their country after the war, and ergo their way of doing it was through a detente. That was the announced policy of late President Hashemi Rafsanjani, who went to far and wide trying to remedy relations, including with Saudi Arabia, which reached really its peak during the next president, who's Sayyid Mohammad Khatami. In 2001, they signed a security agreement with Saudi Arabia, and then another agreement before it in 1999. Both showed the evolving relationship and enhancement of relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but also Arab countries in general. And so things started to change, but the United States came in with the war on Afghanistan and the war on Iraq. The biggest rifts we saw after the war of 80s was over the developments in Iraq, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between Iran and many Arab countries, but also between Arab countries and Arab countries. It wasn't only Iran, Arab countries. And so when it comes to Iraq, many believe that Iran was interfering more than it has the right to, including Saudi Arabia and many other countries. At the same time, the Iranians were viewing Iraq as a space that other countries are trying to hurt Iran's national security through, including the United States and then later on ISIS. The United States, the mightiest army, was on Iran's borders from two sides, from Afghanistan and Iraq. And at the same time, you sitting in Iran, you could hear debates in the Congress on the use and the necessity to use these countries as launch pads against Iran and Syria. So the threat was serious, and the Iranians looked at the new Iraq through the prism of U.S. threat. And so they tried to back the political process within Iraq, at the same time push back against U.S. continued presence in Iraq. After that, after the United States withdrew in 2011, another storm took Iraq by surprise. That is the ISIS storm in 2014, another threat to Iran's national security. It wasn't only against Iraq; it was against Iran as well. And so the Iranians got involved against supporting Iraq and supporting and training the Hashd al-Sha'bi to push back against ISIS, which was successful. And in both cases, when Saddam was toppled, and also, of course, the Iranians stayed, neutral. They announced their borders were closed. They are not part of it, but they were happy with Saddam being brought down. And their allies, the opposition that they supported for a lengthy period, were, being the new leaders of Iraq. That gave Iran a lot of sway in Iraq. So helping it support the system, at the same time helping it to push back against U.S. continued presence in Iraq. In 2014, when ISIS came in, and of course many countries in the region backed ISIS, and that's, I think, is known now. It came against Iraq and the political system that was consolidating in Iraq, but also against Iran's National Security Council. The closest ISIS got to Iran's borders was roughly 20 miles away from Iran borders. And so it was very much felt within Iran. We saw 2 bombings in Iran by ISIS affiliates coming from Iraq and Afghanistan. And so things started to change, and the Iranians got more involved. And afterwards, of course, we saw what happened in Syria, Iran back in the Syrian regime as an ally against, a myriad of countries trying to bring down the system. There's a very good clip by the former Prime Minister of Qatar in describing how Arab countries and Turkey got involved in this entirety of this mess, so talking about 2 operation rooms being established in Jordan and in Turkey, trying to send in arms and fighters to bring down the system. And so the Iranians saw it as it was unfolding, that the region is conspiring against Iran and its allies in the region. It wasn't about democracy. It wasn't about none of these countries that were involved in that campaign were democratic. And so they didn't care really about democracy. And so it was a strategic strife. The Iranians got involved, and then things, evolved into 24 when the Assad regime fell, and now a new regime came in. Afterwards, the Israelis expanded their influence, the land grab in southern Syria, the protectorate they created in southern Syria. They also got into a war with Lebanon, trying to get as much of it as much as they can of its southern lands. They waged a war on Iran. It became Israel became basically more wild in dealing with its surroundings, but also with Iran. And so the strategic logic of Iran, when looking back and backtracking what the strategic debates were when Iran got involved in Syria, makes a lot of sense now that we see how Israel is dealing with the after Assad Syria and the region generally. And so now this is how the Iranians view it. Of course, Arabs have other way of looking at it. And so, and again, it's not collective Arab view. Iraq had a very close view to Iran, to what was transpiring in Syria. Lebanon is divided. Egypt was very close to Iran's view. Algeria was very close to Iran's view when it comes to Syrian developments. Other countries were against Iran's view. So it was a regional rift. It wasn't an Iran-Arab rift. And so based on it, Iran got close to some Arab countries, but also got away from other countries because of basically the differences they had in the region on Syria and more broadly on how to deal with Israel. Now, this war brought a new, layer to all of this past, not easy, really track record of Iran-Arab relations, with Iran being forced to fight the United States on Arab soil. And that was unprecedented. But at the same time, if we go back also into history, we could see that Iran never attacked those countries, but when it was attacked. And that, I think, could be reassuring to Arab countries. Another thing that can be reassuring moving forward is a non-aggression pact that Iran proposed initially 10 years ago or 12 years ago. I have to look the dates for that exact year. But they proposed it, and the non-aggression pact was basically about not to attack one another and not to let a third party to use our lands against one another. Now, of course, GCC countries did not accept it, did not basically respond to Iran for obvious reasons. They have bases in their countries. And so that didn't materialize in any meaningful way. But I think moving forward, with the strategic question that I talked about initially in our interview, that, well, we have to have a collective security, otherwise we will not have security, and how to deal with the security of the region and the countries in the region, specifically in the Persian Gulf or around the Persian Gulf, being the main strategic question. I think thinking about a non-aggression pact, thinking about the future of those bases, thinking about how to have a security arrangement within which not only GCC countries, but also Iraq and Iran can be part of, and Yemen also. These countries can have a stronger security architecture without really, observing other nations' interests, including those of the United States, China, other countries. But the region should deal with the security. I think that can guarantee the future of the security of the Persian Gulf. Other than that, I think we are bound to see more, differences moving forward if that is not to happen. It's a bit of a stretch to expect many countries to just switch from a security umbrella by the United States to a regional one, because strategic cultures does not change overnight; it needs time. But I think debates on these important issues have already started, and I've heard some of them in those countries, and I've been in contact with many of my Arab friends, and I can see that this is an evolving process that can lead to something regional that can lower the tension and lead to the betterment of relations.
Okay, I want to return, later on, I want to return to the security architecture which you spoke about, and you mentioned there's discussions happening. I think it's clear it's even happening, in Time Magazine and The Economist, where people are speaking about, the fact that the Arab world now, they've been betrayed by a large extent by these US bases, and they need to start looking elsewhere. And obviously the geography of just sheer geography, that's a reality, dictates that, there may be a security architecture being looked at. And also I want to come to Iran. But before that, just on Syria, and yes, I know that this is a very, this is the big issue when it comes to looking at Iran's actions of the last 25 years or so. But and you're right, there was a lot of countries that got involved. There's a lot of states that got involved. Lots of people backed various militia. But do you think, given the violence that eventually was carried out by Assad-backed, factions, which included Iranian-backed factions, which included Hezbollah, do you think there's some regret within Iran's leadership over how some of those militias conducted themselves? And I'm not saying they were the only ones who were violent. There was a lot of violence on all sides, and Syria was an awfully devastating war. But sometimes that's also, people just want to kind of justify it by saying, there was violence on all sides. At the end of the day, people are responsible for the violence they carry out. Do you think there's some regret retrospectively, over some of the actions that these militias that were backed by Iran carried out in Syria? Because it definitely has. You talk about building relations, which I think people now see the strategic value of that. People do not trust Israel and the USA, especially the Arab street. But this particular thing kind of makes them think: can we really trust Iran when it comes down to it? So do you think there's some regret about that?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, people and states cannot undo what they did. I don't see really that much of a personal love between President Assad and Iranian government. There was good connection that was strategic, but President Assad and his regime were neither, similar to Iran, nor their conduct within the country was in any shape or form close to how the Islamic Republic conducts its internal politics and internal, policies generally. And so there was nothing of similarity between the two. That was a strategic decision that was taken to protect an ally because of the strategic value it's had on the borders of Israel and on the borders of Lebanon and on the borders of Iraq. And so, back then, during the Civil War, there was nothing really to be reckoned with the way you are talking about. That is, the regime is bad. Well, it's bad. How about the opposition? And I mean, there is this talking point about Iran or the Assad regime killing 500,000 Syrians, 600,000 Syrians. We know for a fact that these were killed on both sides. It wasn't, half of them at least were killed defending the system, the Assad regime, and half of them were killed by it or its allies. And so it was a mess. And when you go back, you could see that many countries did what they can to force or enforce their vision and policy. I'm sure if we go back and we know where things are headed, many policies would have changed. The Iranians in 2011 started discussions with the opposition of Syria, but then all of a sudden, with President Obama announcing that, well, in August 2011, announcing that, well, Assad must go, and then the closure of many embassies in Damascus, the Iranians felt like, well, he's being targeted because he's an ally of Iran. They didn't do this to Mubarak. They didn't do this to to Ali Abdullah Saleh. They didn't do this to many others who were faced with also popular uprising. Why are they doing it to Syria? Because of such and such. So the rationale evolved. There was not a decision from the get-go to get so deeply involved in Syria. I have a piece in the International Affairs, the evolution of Iran's strategy in Syria. I basically track the developments of Iran's strategy in Syria. It wasn't really set on the get-go. It evolved over time based on the developments. But I think moving forward, it doesn't really matter who rules Syria and how it is governed. Now, of course, that's
I mean,
on a personal level,
Syrians would care about how it's governed.
Of course, but on a strategic level for a country, for me personally, of course, I care about how societies are governed and how they are being dealt with. But on a strategic level, it doesn't really make sense for Iran or for Syria not to get close to one another, because their rival or their foe is the same. Their aims is freeing the land. I mean, one of the objectives that is being talked about time and time again by President Ashara is that we want a united Syria. We want to free our lands. Where is the land occupied? It's in the south. And the protectorate that the Israelis have created in southern Syria is another example. So there's a strategic, really, logic to a revision of the relationship away from what transpired in the past and moving forward towards more strategic, objectives. Now, of course, Syrians want a better government. That's their of course, that's their call. And as a person, I would back that. But generally, I look at Iran's strategy in the region through a different lens, that is strategy as a strategy, as a state strategy linked to Iran's national security. And so through that prism, there's a common strategic interest between Iran and Syria and Iraq and Lebanon to stand up to Israel and what it is doing in Lebanon and in Syria and against others, including in Iraq and in Iran. And so I see that, I call it the logic of the state. That logic will prevail. When and how, we are yet to see. But of course, I agree with you. There are lots of regrets about how the country could have basically moved in a different manner that could have changed the situation without harming Syrian and Iranian interest, but also without the civil war that we saw for more than a decade and killed many Syrians in the process and non-Syrians in the process in Syria.
Okay, just there's two more things I want to discuss, and they shouldn't take too long. And thank you for your time. So I think the big bogeyman, and we've discussed it a lot, is Israel. Right? Israel has been unhinged. It's created instability in the region for a long time, and since October 7th has been behaving in its most brutal fashion, both against the Palestinian people, and it's also hit Lebanon. It's instigated a war on Iran. It's killed many Iranian civilians. It's even struck flotilla boats as far as Tunisia. It's struck Qatar. It's really it's completely unhinged, and it's isolated. And as you mentioned earlier in the interview, it's probably the most hated country on earth now. There was an idea probably about 5 or 6 years ago that Israel could eventually be softly integrated into the region. The Abraham Accords was on the table. Now it seems like the only state that's still eager to have a formal alliance with Israel in any way is the UAE. Morocco still has an alliance, of course, but I think that's just it's entrenched, and that's why it exists. What do you think will happen to Israel in the next sort of 10, 15, 20 years? I know it's a difficult question to answer, and you're not a futurist, and no one can actually really tell the story. But they seem to be going down this trajectory of alienating more and more people. The society seems incapable of actually correcting the state, even though it is a democracy. What do you think is going to happen? You said that it makes strategic sense, that the logic would be that states unite, its neighbors, and the region unites against it. But what does that mean for Israel? What do you think will happen to it?
Well, I think the biggest foe to Israel is its own, society moving towards the hardliners and being basically hardliners in the political system. You see, the right wing of Israel politics is now governing, and even if Bibi Netanyahu is not elected, another right-wing person or figure or a movement would take over. There is nothing left for less hardline people in the political system in Israel. And this is the biggest foe to Israel because it keeps it in a circle of violence. A prime minister is elected to fight and to bring down the Iranian system, to chop off Lebanese territory added to Israel, to chop off Syrian territory added to Israel, moving forward maybe Jordan, maybe Egypt, right? So that push will continue with this, extremism we see in the society. And if a prime minister moves according to plan, he will wage wars to be defeated, basically, because it's wars on Iran where defeats. And it's wars on Lebanon and Syria. I don't see them bringing them more security. If anything, it will continue them feeling insecure. Now, after 15 months of ceasefire, unilateral ceasefire, because Israel kept, pummeling Lebanon, but Lebanese didn't revert back or didn't react to it. Still, the northern citizens did not return many of them did not return, majority of them did not return because they don't feel secure, they don't feel safe. And I think that is to continue with the extremism we see within the Israeli political system. And that creates cycles of violence. Every now and then, Israel would find itself, the Israeli political figures would find themselves under pressure to wage a war, to do something about Lebanon, do something about Syria, do something about Iran or other countries, on Yemen. But eventually they can't win, basically. They would only increase the insecurity and the way the Israelis feel unsafe and insecure. And that would lead to more extremism. And that extremism will translate into a more violent form of dealing with the neighborhood. That cycle eventually have the potentiality of breaking the entirety of Israel, to my understanding. That cycle can be broken and changed moving forward, but I don't see it, because if you look at it from the end of the 70s, when the Likud took over, and then moving forward with different, movements and parties taking over, from the 90s almost, we had only right-wing figures, with exceptions, taking over. And now, in the past more than a decade now, 2 decades almost, less than 2 decades, it's only hard-wing politicians taking over. There's no space for, leftist or liberals to take over. And I think that's a societal shift towards extremism that can dictate the future of Israel. At the same time, its foes are getting stronger by the day, because Iran fought 2 wars. Now it's only logical and natural for it to strengthen its means of hitting back once attacked. And so the insecurity felt coming from Iran will only increase by the day, with more skirmishes with Israel, or attacks from Israel against Iran or its allies in the region. And so I think that's what we are seeing, what we see unfolding. And imagine if a bigger war with tenfold what Iran hit Israel is to break, because Iran is building, because needs to defend itself. What will happen? How the security and safety will be felt within Israel? At this point, many Israelis are leaving because they don't feel secure in the country. I was just yesterday looking at some specific, settlements in the north. Many of their people actually left the country altogether. Some of them left to the Gosh Dan in the middle of Israel. Some of them left the country altogether. And some of them are not coming back at all. And so that's how security and safety is being basically targeted by extremism within Israel, not by its neighbors, because that extremism led to what Israel has done and is doing, and I think it will be doing moving forward in the next decade or so. And I think that will affect the future of Israel big time. Whether or not Israel will continue depends on the extremism and the level of extremism within Israel itself.
Okay, final question. You mentioned, you've mentioned that there's this need for the the region, the Arab countries who make up the region that are bordering Iran, to sort of have some sort of alliance, a rapprochement of sorts. There's been talk for a while now. It's often hot and cold for rapprochement between Turkey, the Arab world, the key countries in there being Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iraq historically, and Iran. Now, obviously, that is not something that it's something that Israel would obviously try to deter, as well as the U.S. I mean, even if Israel didn't exist, the U.S. would probably try to deter this, because that would be a very strong bloc, whether it's just a economic bloc, whatever kind of bloc that is, that would be a threat to any hegemonic power, right? How realistic do you think rapprochement is, and what do you think is the best way to kind of get there, in the next few years?
You mean between Iran and Arab countries?
Iran, the Arab countries, and Turkey. These three blocs.
Well, there's before this war and the previous war, the logic of deterring Israel was not that much strong in the region. At this point, I think Turkey being talked about within Israel as the next target. Saudi Arabia is feeling and feeling concerned about and the concern is higher than ever about Israel hegemonizing the region. And so there's this sense of Israeli push for supremacy in the region that is bringing countries together against it. Alliances are built on either collective threat or collective interest or collective ideational frameworks. And this is a very clear collective threat against Arab countries, Turkey, and Iran. I think that has the potentiality to push them together. Now, the problem is, if only a threat brings you together when the threat is not there, or some countries feel that it's not that much relevant anymore, the alliance would fall apart. The big challenge to this kind of alliance is to build mechanisms to basically strengthen the alliance, not only on a source of threat, but also on a collective interest that is to be built in the region. We had that back in 2009, for instance, between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, with the talk about the Schengen visa between them, the four countries, to basically, like the Schengen, in the Schengen area in EU, to strengthen societal but also economic, trade and industrial connections between the four countries. But unfortunately, that hit the hard drugs of the events that unfolded in Syria and drifted Iran and Turkey and Iraq apart from one another. Then ISIS came. Everything changed. But there is this precedent. And I think moving forward, if the alliance against the collective threat is to be formed, there need to be work on alliance on collective interests as well. And those precedents can help.
Hassan Ahmadian, thank you so much for your time, and it's been a real pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.